Peace and blessings, all. You just tuned in to another installment of the Blackpages Mixtape Volume 2, entitled Reality of a Black Planet. And before I begin anything, I just want to start off by saying free Dr. York. And just to say, whenever we have people amongst us that's willing to stand up for us, we should also stand up for them in whatever ways possible. I just want to start this off by reading a few excerpts from the infamous Willie Lynch letter. Now, if anybody's not familiar with that, as a black person, I implore you to Google that. Google "Let's Make a Slave" and the letter will come up, and you should read this just to, see the intricacies of this doctrine and how it still remains relevant today as far as our mental bondage in the West. But I'll go ahead and read this. And Willie Lynch, if anybody's not familiar with Willie Lynch was a slave owner in the Caribbean who came to the mainland United States to instruct slave owners on how to manage their slaves. So we'll jump right into this thing. This is a quote from Mr. Lynch. If we are to sustain our economy, we must break both of the beasts together, the nigger and the horse. All right, another excerpt. The black slave, after receiving this indoctrination, shall carry on and will become self-refueling and self-generating for hundreds of years, maybe thousands, right? Both horse and nigger are no good to the economy in the wild or natural state. And just to briefly interject, in a wild or natural state, so in our natural state, prior to these three monotheistic religions, in our natural state, like we spoke about in the first installment of the Black Pages, we had our own culture, our own way of life, our own way of thinking, our own way of doing things. Just to touch on that, another excerpt from Mr. Lynch. Our experts warned us about the possibility of this phenomenon occurring, for they say that the mind has a strong drive to correct and recorrect itself over a period of time, if it can touch some substantial original historical base, and they advise us that the best way to deal with this phenomenon is to shave off the brute's mental history and create a multiplicity of phenomena or illusions, so that each illusion will twirl in its own orbit, something akin to floating balls in a vacuum. With that being said, I want to interject, what is Stockholm Syndrome? Now, in Nuwaupu, we speak about the spell of Kingu, but I'm going to kind of dumb it down a little bit and use some clinical terminology real quick. What is Stockholm Syndrome? In psychology, Stockholm Syndrome is a term used to describe a paradoxical phenomenon wherein hostages express adulation and have positive feelings toward their captors. These feelings are generally considered irrational in light of the danger or risk endured by the victim, who essentially mistakes a lack of abuse from the captor as an act of kindness. Fast forward, what is mind control? Mind control refers to a process in which a group or individual systematically uses unethically manipulative methods to persuade others to conform to the wishes of the manipulators, often to the detriment of the person being manipulated. Okay? And if that's not touching upon our situation here in America and, whitewashed Negroes, whatever the case may be, Uncle Tomism, however you want to call it, however you want to slice it, if that doesn't touch upon that, I really don't know what does. Now, the next piece of literature that I really want to just quote excerpts from in this introduction to the Black Pages is a book put out in 1971 by Amanubi Rakata, also known in this day and time as Dr. York, still relevant to this day. And I'll go right ahead in the quote. Too much stress has been put on the physical by Ethiopian organizations and not nearly enough on the mental is why we have not progressed properly toward liberation, for liberation is mental as well as physical separation from adverse forces, and the mental separation comes first. There is no such thing as successful physical liberation without first having a mental liberation. When we achieve mental liberation, then physical liberation will come natural. All right? Another excerpt from the same book, Behind the Nine Ball. We Ethiopian scientists do not expect all woolly-haired people to be receptive to nine reason and nine knowledge. It will take time for some to understand, and there are others who will neither understand nor care. But those among us who are intelligent by nature will understand, accept, and adhere. These are the ones we are searching for these are the survival and future of the Ethiopian race. No one can make another intelligent. A person must be born intelligent, and that intelligent among us are the only ones who can liberate self. No one can liberate a person. A person must liberate self by understanding, accepting, and following liberation knowledge. All right? We're going to go into another excerpt. Mental liberation knowledge informs us that before woolly-haired people were called Negroes by Caucasians, we were called Ethiopian. And before we were known as Ethiopians by the Greeks, we were called Nubians by the ancients. The word Ethiopian and Nubian are the same in meaning. They both mean ether, life-giving, light-giving, burning energies that the sun produces called prominences and sunshine. All right? Remember, when we say Ethiopian, we are not referring only to woolly-haired people born in the state of Africa, known as Ethiopia, but woolly-haired people wherever they are, namely all people in the Ethiopian race. The root word of Ethiopian is the word ether, and it means our origin is the sun, because the sun is nine, and nine ether sun produces the Ethiopian race. Quote, Amanu Birakata. So, with that being said, we're going to explore from a historical point of view, from a historical perspective, what it means to be an Ethiopian as opposed to a Negro or nigger, colored, or whatever the case may be, and what our race has actually contributed to the world. All right? I'm Tahotep Asade, and this is the Blackpages Mixtape Volume 2, affectionately called Reality of a Black Planet. Enjoy. Alright, first I would like to start off with some basic facts, just to kind of prime this whole lecture right here. Firstly, Egypt is in Africa, and the Nile River starts in the Great Lakes region of Africa near Uganda. The first group of Africans were a tribe called the Twa, erroneously called Pygmies. I don't know if anybody's familiar with Greek mythology. If anybody's familiar with Greek mythology, the Pygmies, and they are in Greek mythology, are children of Gaia, children of the deity of the earth, if that's any indication of anything. And these Twa migrated from that region up the Nile and outward across Africa and the entire planet. And I repeat, the entire planet. Thus the title of this lecture called Reality of a Black Planet. Every person of African descent on the planet is a descendant of these little black Twa, or pygmy people. If anyone remembers the movie The Mummy 2, where the pygmies are guarding the pyramid in the middle of the jungle, and they go inside to get the scepter of the Scorpion King, or whatever the case may be, and they shoot with their little blowguns and everything like that. Even though I must inform you that The Mummy, the whole series, is very historically inaccurate, and that's a whole nother lecture in itself. But just that aspect of the movie, they put different things in movies. They kind of taunt us a little bit, I suppose. I don't know. But even though this is a very inaccurate movie, you know, you see the jewels in the movie are there, but we just have to be around to decipher them and know what we're looking at and know they're talking about us. But anyway, now we must remember that African people are the first people, the indigenous people on the planet. We have the strongest genes on the planet and the oldest languages on the planet. The dates that they give you in school and in general for the planet and for our history, and as Parmazul Amnu Malachi York always tells us, our story as opposed to his story. The dates that they give you for his story are all wrong, because they have to fit themselves in his story, because they have the shortest history of all the groups of people on the planet. But anyway, Lucy, which is also known as Kenyapithecis, which was unearthed in 1974 at Hadar in the Awas Valley of Ethiopia's Afar region. Lucy is estimated to be 3.2 million years old, and they're still finding older remains in Africa, proving we walked alongside the dinosaurs. Another point to make is that the Sahara Desert was not always a desert. It has only been a desert for about 10,000 years. Prior to that, it received considerably more rain than it does today, making it a very savanna-like area. And if anybody has the time and the resources, Google lakes of the Sahara, and they tell you how there were multiple lakes that formed in the Sahara, in the current region that is the Sahara Desert. It was full of lakes. I mean, how could it was vast, and water was everywhere as far as the Sahara Desert. Okay, and they had monsoons in the Sahara Desert, what is now the Sahara Desert. But another point is that the Sphinx, which is located on the west bank of the Nile in Giza, in Egypt, which is in the desert, and originally had to be unearthed by the people who found it because it was covered in sand, has water erosion on it from some period of time when the desert got a considerable amount of rainfall, like I was just talking about. So Egyptologists would tell you that the Sphinx was built during the Old Kingdom in Egypt, but it was obviously older than the 10,000-year-old Sahara Desert itself. Okay, and just to point to another movie, doesn't that remind you of the Planet of the Apes in the Forbidden Zone? Yeah, it gets better than that, but yeah, y'all reflect on the movie, The Planet of the Apes, as we go through this, and it's really going to, some light bulbs are going to go off. So this proves that the 10,000 plus years ago, our ancestors had the technology and the know-how to build the Sphinx. Okay, another point is the stone circles at Nabta Playa, which are dated at 8,000 years old. And by the way, you can't carbon date stones, so they dated fossil remains of the animals and black Africans based on their cranial structure, who were buried near the stone circles and megaliths. Just like Stonehenge, which was made much later, these stone circles give evidence of a calendar which takes thousands upon thousands of years to come up with, mathematics, and accurate astrological knowledge. And like the pyramids, scientists still don't know how they moved the stones. And Malachi Kobina York speaks about Nabta Playa in the Actual Fact book series. And for those of us who need confirmation from the Caucasian, check out the book Black Genesis by Robert Bauval, Bauval, where a Caucasian tells you that we were the first people on the planet. Imagine that. The research of Joseph H. Greenberg, it indicates that the Kushite branch of languages were far more differentiated from each other than were those of any other branch, showing that they had evolved at a very early date and had done so independently for much longer than any other branch of languages. Based on Greenberg's research, scholars, which they talk when they say scholars, they talking about Caucasian, suggests that perhaps as early as 12,000 to 10,000 BC, Africans, Proto-Kushite speakers, migrated from Ethiopia, Central Africa, spreading out into the rest of Africa and the Near East. Isn't that what I just said at the beginning of this? They say this Proto-Kushite tongue evolved not only into Kushite, Egyptian, Berber, and Chadic tongues, but into the Semitic branch as well. This includes Hebrew, Phoenician, Arabic, and Assyrian. Now imagine that, religious people. Now Dr. Malachi Kobina York has been saying that since the 60s, that originally everyone on earth spoke one language, but for those who need the confirmation, and you can trace a people by their language, just like we can trace a people through, we speak English now, the American dialect of English. We can go through Old English and Middle English and all that, but it's going to go back to German, which is going to go back to Latin, which is going to go back to Greek. You can trace a people through their language. Again, I'm using these facts to kind of frame this discussion, because when we begin to speak about the contradictions the contributions of Ethiopians to the world, we will see that these facts will be supporting details. The last fact that I would like to touch upon is the fact that prehistory just means before Europeans recorded his story. There are many temples across the globe that have undecipherable writings from civilizations tens of thousands of years old. Egypt didn't have dynasties according to the Egyptians themselves. Their civilization existed since time immemorial. Caucasians assigned them dynasties. To be specific, a man named Menethio in his book Aegyptos assigned them dynasties. The Nubians from the south built Egypt, and according to the Egyptians, Egypt was a colony of Ethiopia. Okay? Now, according to Wikipedia, the Kingdom of Kush was an ancient African state centered on confluences of the blue and white Nile and the river Atbara in what is now the Republic of the Sudan. It was one of the earliest civilizations to develop in the Nile River Valley, having been referred to as Nubia and as Ethiopia in ancient Greek and Greco-Roman records. The Kushites left their mark on various aspects of the ancient world, and their legacy is still readily discernible from various archaeological field sites throughout modern Sudan. Now, honestly, this is fairly accurate, but we'll go into more intricate and intimate detail with this. The dates, as we will explore, are all wrong for the establishment of the Kingdom of Kush as put out by Wikipedia, and that's as to be expected. Wikipedia, we expect that. But Nubia was a term coined by the Romans to describe the region south of Egypt. The Egyptians themselves never used that term. Nubia is derived from the word nub meaning gold, as areas south of Egypt is very rich in gold. Like I was saying, I think in part one of this, there's a 48,000-year-old gold mine in South Africa. But as Dr. Malachi Kobina-York points out in the 9 Ball series, we were called Nubans. And Nub is also a deity, as in Amanub Rayakta. The place they call Nubia had various kingdoms such as Tarseti, Ta-Nehisi, Yam, and Kerma, which all predate Egypt by thousands of years. Tarseti goes back at least to 7000 BC, and Kerma is overstood to be older than that. Okay, and with just some of these basic facts, I just wanted to frame our presentation so that we can paint a picture here that's worth 1,000 words. These basic facts should provide our foundation to build off in this second installment of the Blackpages Mixtape. Peace. Alright, as far as ancient people are concerned, we're told about cavemen. And when we think about cavemen, the pictures of Fred Flintstone and Barney Rubble pop into our heads. Now, there are no blacks in the Flintstones, or the Jetsons for that matter. It shows you what they got planned for your future. But like I was saying, there's no blacks in the Flintstones, and rightfully so, as there was no Stone Age in Africa. Now, Drusilla Dungy Houston, in her book written in 1929, Wonderful Ethiopians of the Kushite Empire, states, in Africa, we made no evidence of the slow progress of man up from the barbaric state. The Sudan shows no evidence of a Stone Age. The African seems to have passed directly to use metals without intermediate stages. She goes on to say, so one civilized race of prehistoric times had tamed the domestic animals with the same infinite patience this race developed wild plants into tame fruits and cereals. The Kushite was the only race that could have performed this service, for other races in historic times despised agriculture. Nomadic races are fierce and impatient. They have a nature opposite to habits that make for patience and perseverance, which are the steps to art and literature. All right. So basically what she was saying, nomads don't domesticate animals or plant crops or develop sciences or astrology or philosophy or writing for that matter. They're too busy trying to survive, moving from place to place. You know, okay. And Houston goes on to write, and this is a sister, by the way, I'm referring to, who wrote this book. In the thousands of years since the domestication of animals, the historic nations of our time have tamed one bird. In the light of these facts, ancient Africans yoked the wild ox, tame the cow, the horse, the sheep. This is why animals play such an important part in the old Kushite mythology. Africans subdued the elephant as early as the Kushites of Asia. Ancient sculptures show the African elephant tamed. These indefatigable men domesticated wheat, barley, oats, rye, and rice. In fact, all the staple plants of our civilization were fully developed so far back in the distant ages that their wild species have disappeared. So basically, our ancestors were the first to breed and domesticate animals and plants, thus a knowledge of genetics. In school, they teach you about Gregor Mendel and the pea plant, but not about our African ancestors. So today, they grow synthetic foods and clone animals, but the same knowledge was understood by our ancient Kushite ancestors. Just as I said in Volume 1 that an albino is a rarity, and an entire race of albinos must be intentionally bred. Just some food for thought. All right. Houston also states the ancients said the Ethiopians first taught them the worship of the gods and sacrifices. The agricultural Ethiopian developed the idea of a settled hearth and home. He developed very early the art of smelting iron, which is found in the pyramids, and gave knowledge of its manufacture to the world. Okay, an excerpt from the book called Voice of Africa, Volume 2, page 261, states, Frobenius, the great anthropologist, states Ethiopia is an ancient classical land. In olden days, its inhabitants were considered the most pious and oldest of mankind. In many quarters, Meroe is thought to be indebted to primitive Egypt. From a standpoint of ethnology, we must unhesitatingly reject this supposition. The Nubians possessed an independent and individual religion in the earliest known times, the code of which impressed the Egyptians, who gave an account of it to their authors of old. Okay, basically what she's saying, Egyptian religion comes from Ethiopia, and the three monotheistic religions come from Egypt, or the Egyptian religion. Just as we know, well, those of us who do our research, Easter is an Egyptian holiday. Jesus comes from Horus, the son of Osiris, born of an immaculate conception by the Virgin Mother Isis. Okay, Champollion, the so-called father of Egyptology, in his memoirs, they go on to say the lower valley of the Nile was originally peopled from Abyssinia and Meroe, Abyssinia being Ethiopia. The most ancient cities that they founded were Thebes and Edfu. In the beginning, Egypt was ruled by priest kings who reigned in the name of some deity. It goes on to say the old race of the first dynasties, the race of Thoth, Amun-Re, and Asar, had turned its greatest strength in wider and wider circles across North Africa and up the coast of Western Europe to the eastward. They had civilized the Mesopotamian plains and had swept on to India. Their relation toward Egypt became more and more hostile, though full-blooded Ethiopians still sat upon the throne. The idols of Egypt, to every last detail, were gods of Meroe. All right? The Encyclopedia of Biblical Literature says, there is every reason to conclude that the separate colonies of priestcraft spread from Meroe into Egypt, and the primal monuments in Ethiopia strongly confirm the native traditions reported by the Dorus Siculus that the worship of Zeus Amun originated in Meroe, also the worship of Osiris. This would render highly probable the opinion that commerce, science, and art descended into Egypt from the Upper Nile. All right? So in a nutshell, that shows us how the culture of Egypt originated in the south, but also how the gods were understood to have been real, walking, talking people who lived and did physical things and had physical descendants, and how when they went to other places, they were called other things, but it was the same God. Amun is Zeus in Greek, and Jupiter is and Jupiter in Rome, and Indra in India, yet the same deity, Amun. Okay, to quote wonderful Ethiopians of the Kushite Empire, again, the author states, the Purunas, the ancient historical books of India, speak of the civilization of Ethiopia as being older than that of Egypt. These Sanskrit books mention the names of old Kushite kings that were worshipped in India and who were adopted and changed to suit the fancy of the later people of Greece and Rome. Okay, according to the author, the central seat of Ethiopia was not the Meroe of our day, which is very ancient, but a kingdom that preceded it by many ages that was called Meru. Lenormant spoke of the first god of the Hindu, king of Meru. He was deified and became the chief representative of the supreme deity. Thus was primitive India settled by colonists from Ethiopia. Early writers said there was very little difference in the color or feature of the people of the two countries. All right. Malachi Kobina York goes into greater details about this in the Holy Tablets, chapter 3, The Scientist, and in the actual Fact Book series. If you can, seek out the scroll Enki as Creator. All right. And the author, Drusilla Dungy Houston writes, an old poem, Phrygia, spelled Phrygia, was a history of Dionysus, one of the most celebrated of the old Ethiopians. It was written in a very old language and character. He preceded Menes by many ages. Okay, Menes is the founder of the first dynasty of Egypt. Dionysus is the Greek name for Osiris. This wasn't a myth to these people. I can't stress that enough. It was a real historical person who actually physically lived and ruled. Okay, Houston writes, Amun-Ra, from whom a long line of Egyptian monarchs descended, was an Ethiopian god. Okay. The pharaohs claimed to be literal and lineally descended from Amun-Ra. The ancients looked upon Zeus, Apollo, and Osiris as persons. Amun-Ra was the Zeus of Greece. Zeus was king of kings because he was chief ruler of Ethiopia and over the lesser kings in his wide domain stretching from India to far Norway. Okay, so forget about the old saying, people say, I'm black and I'm proud. No, I'm black and I'm God. Remember that. John Baldwin writes in Prehistoric Nations, the authentic books that would have given us the true history concerning him perished long before the Hellenes, the Greeks of historical times, distorted the story of Dionysus and converted him into their drunken god of wine. They misconstrued and misused the old Kushite mythology wherever they failed to understand it and sought to appropriate it entirely to themselves. So you see, back in the day, all the gods were black, and everyone imitated us and wanted to be us. So they distorted the history to conveniently place themselves in positions that we already occupied and erase us from history. Sound familiar? Sound like the Forbidden Zone from the Planet of the Apes. They blew it up. When he sees the Statue of Liberty and everything like that. Real familiar, doesn't it? Okay. Baldwin continues, with the withdrawal of the Ethiopian priesthood from Egypt to Napata, the people of Lower Nile lost the sense of the real meaning of their religion, which steadily deteriorated with the language after their separation from Ethiopia. So basically their whole culture, their whole livelihood, it was a product of the South, or the blacks of the South, of the Ethiopians of the South. Egypt got all its spices, drugs, incense, cotton, and gold from the land of the South. The Encyclopedia of Biblical Literature states, these principal trade routes may still be pointed out by a chain of ruins extending from the shores of the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean. The cities of Ajule, Aksum, Meroe, Thebes, and Carthage were the links in this chain. Okay, Ethiopia was said to be so wealthy and rich and with resources that its prisoners were bound with gold chains. The embalming techniques were superior to that of the Egyptians. They had laws, prisons, commerce, knowledge of working metals, etc. Ethiopia, the land south of Egypt, it was commonly known as the land of the dark races. There were artisans, porters, and soldiers, known for their honesty, cheerfulness, and blunt nature. And I'm pretty sure we all know some Negroes who are very blunt in nature. I being one of them myself. Even the concept of building castles, like they have castles in Europe and everything, was first coined by the Ethiopians. So they had castles in Ethiopia prior to them even having castles in Europe. They stole that from us as well. Okay, to quote the wonderful Ethiopians of the Kushite Empire again, Reclus declares that when the whole of Europe was still overrun by savage tribes that have left no record behind them, Egypt existed a civilized power of greatness. astronomical observations, arithmetic, geometry, architecture, all of the arts and nearly all the sciences and industries of the present day were known when the Greeks were still cavemen. Okay? Again, there are no black Flintstones, like I said earlier. So when they try to, whitewash us into believing that they invented everything, keep in mind they are the biggest liars of all time. They came to us for answers to their questions. And I just read this excerpt. Case in point, the author Houston speaks of the records that the Egyptians kept, and I quote, "The priests of Sais said to Cylon, you Greeks are novices in all the knowledge of the antiquity. You are ignorant of what passed here or amongst yourselves in the days of old. The history of 8,000 years is deposited in our sacred books, but we can ascend to much higher antiquity and tell you what our fathers have done for 9,000 years. I mean their institutions, their laws, their brilliant accomplishments." Byron points out that neither Solon nor Plato thought this impossible. The Greeks could tell nothing of their progenitors and but little of the Pelasgian race that preceded them in the Hellenistic lands. There can be no doubt, says Baldwin, that the Egyptians preserved old records of the early periods of their history extended beyond Menes. Menes being the first pharaoh of the first dynasty. This knowledge was lost to our time by the destruction of the Alexandrian library and the fanatical zeal which destroyed all pagan manuscripts. So basically, we lost a lot of this information proving who we really are when they burnt the Library of Alexandria. And all throughout our little journey into our story, not his story, but our story, we're going to run into instances where Europeans have destroyed or distorted records to conveniently fit themselves into positions of influence as people. Even your Christian missionaries made it their business to destroy ancient manuscripts, so-called pagan literature, upon their arrival into Nubia and actually other lands. I just want to stress that in this volume of the Black Pages that, the Egyptians are black and Egypt is in Africa, because it seems so hard for our people to really accept who we are in certain instances. Egyptologists try to make it seem like the Egyptians and the Nubians are two different races, but as you can see from these few excerpts, that the Egyptians and the Nubians were originally the same people. Pharaohs would marry Kushite queens to legitimize their claims to the throne in Egypt. One example of this is the pharaoh Ahmose, who married Nefertari, the princess of Ethiopia. He was one of the pharaohs who drove out the Hyksos after Seqenenre-Tor was killed. Now, Seqenenre-Tor, if anybody's familiar with him, is the real person who the fictitious biblical character, fictitious Masonic character, Hiram Abiff, was taken from, if anybody's familiar with that. In this story, you can find this, Reverend Dr. Malachi York, Malachi Kobina York has written about this. He speaks about this in the book called Jesus Found in Egypt. And to quote wonderful Ethiopians of the Kushite Empire one more time, "Those who contend that the origin of civilization of the Nile was from Asia should note that under Asiatics, Egypt enters its darkest period in history." Basically what she's talking about the Hyksos pharaohs. They destroyed temples and desecrated the Egyptian religion. This is a derivative of where they get your Israelites in bondage story from. Ahmose and Kahmose, two individuals with Moses at the end of their name, just like Ahmose, Kahmose, Thutmose, Ramesses, all derivatives of Moses, child of whoever, child of Tahuti, child of Thought, child of Ramesses, child of Re. That's how they arrive at that. But these individuals, Ahmose and Kahmose, they drove out your Hyksos pharaohs. They drove them across the desert. So that's where you get your story of Moses leading the Israelites across the desert or whatever. They really didn't get led across nowhere. They got kicked out. They were running for their lives across the desert from these pharaohs and everything like that. But just to close the second volume of the Black Pages, we're going to pick up in Volume 3, where we'll continue our discourse on Part 2 of Reality of a Black Planet, where we'll discuss Chaldea, Ancient Arabia, Ancient America, and India. Y'all stay tuned. Peace and love.